My name is Rob Arnold. I'm the Executive Director of Poets House, and I am just delighted to have you all here for what is going to be an incredible night of poetry. These are two poets that I have been, admiring from afar and more recently from close for a long, long time. I was talking to Garrett earlier and saying how I first came across his poetry when I was working at a magazine called Plowshares. In like more than 20 years ago, yeah. So it's such an honor to have you here tonight, and these are challenging times for literary organizations. This challenging time for poetry, for the arts in general, and having you all come out tonight is a kind of resistance, and so I want to thank you for that as well, for being here in community, for showing up, for turning up for the art of poetry, and for being amazing community members. I believe that we'll be having some conversations afterwards, more organic conversations upstairs. For those of you who are local, of course, Poets House is open to all of you. It doesn't belong to just poets, although we have a lot of poetry if you're interested in poetry. So with that, I'm going to leave it there and give it over to my colleague, Leo, who's going to be your MC for the evening. Leo Kreider.
Thank you, Rob. Hello. Welcome, everyone, to Poets House. My name is Leo Kreider. We're very excited to have you here for our two wonderful readers tonight. As Rob mentioned, for those of you who may be new to the space, Poets House is a nonprofit library where we have dedicated public programming, exhibitions, and special collection spaces. And we also have one of the most comprehensive independent poetry collections that's available in open stacks. Our collection upstairs has over 80,000 volumes. Please join us upstairs after the reading to explore a little bit. We're here, we're a resource for you. And alongside that collection, we also have many wonderful reading series, including our New Works series, which this event is a part of, that celebrates recently released poetry publications. So tonight, I'm thrilled to welcome Garrett Hongo and Edward Hirsch, reading from their newest books, My Childhood in Pieces and Ocean of Clouds. Starting with Garrett, we'll have a reading from each poet, followed by a conversation and a few minutes for audience Q&A. So if you have questions, please hold them and keep them in mind for the end of the program. We have books for sale in the lobby, and as I mentioned, we'll have a reception upstairs. So please join us for some wine and to explore the library a little bit. And before we begin, I also want to say thank you to everyone at Knopf and the Poetry Society of New York for co-sponsoring and organizing the event. It's been a pleasure working with you, and we're so grateful to have you here. In Ocean of Clouds, Garrett Hongo writes with musicality and rich sensory detail about the coastlines and waters of his life. Throughout the collection's sweeping lines, Hongo is alert to the possibilities of individual moments of perception and grace. Poet, memoirist, and audio writer Garrett Hongo was born in Volcano, Hawaii, and grew up there and in Los Angeles. He earned his BA from Pomona College and his MFA from the University of California, Irvine, where he studied with the poets C.K. Williams, Howard Moss, and Charles Wright. His poetry collections are Yellow Light, The River of Heaven, which received the Lamont Poetry Prize and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Coral Road. In nonfiction, he has published The Mirror Diary and Volcano, a memoir of Hawaii, perhaps his best-known work. His work has been recognized with fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. He is a frequent contributor of audio articles to Soundstage Ultra and lives in Eugene, where he is a distinguished professor at the University of Oregon. Please give a warm welcome to Garrett Hongo.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you to Poets House and to the Poetry Society for creating this event for our new books. Ed's and mine, you know. I was just saying before the start here that the only time, I think, and the last time we read together was in the late 80s in Honolulu when we tried to outdo each other for funny. And it took Eddie this long to finally get that done. So we want to make sure we recognize that. I'm just going to read a few poems. This is, by the way, actually poetry, unlike Eddie, you know, who's going to slay you with his prose. And I want to thank Mike for the house music, which was very lovely. I mean, it was a nice surprise to hear all that soul music. Y'all mind if I take a picture? If you're not supposed to be with whoever you're next to, you better move now. I want to show my daughter that I actually do give poetry readings, that I'm not just fooling around on the road. This is the prologue to the book, and it starts out in one of my hometowns in LA. Kind of a special place. I think the poem tells you what kind of place it was. It's called I Got Heaven. I swear that in Gardena, on a moonlit suburban street, there are souls that twirl like kites, lashed to the wrists of the living, and spirits who spiral in a solemn limbo between 166th and the long river of stars to Amida's paradise in the west. As though I belonged, I've come from my life of papers and exile to walk among these penitents at the festival of the dead, the booths full of sellers hawking rice cakes and candied plums. All around us, the rhythmic chant of Ondo bursting through loudspeakers, calling out the mimes and changes to all who dance. I stop at a booth and watch a man, deeply tanned from work outdoors, pitching bright, fresh quarters into blue plastic bowls. He wins a porcelain cat, a fishnet bag of marbles, and a bottle of shoyu, and a rattle shaped like a tam-tam he gives to a child. I hear the words of a Motown tune carry through the gaudy air. Got sunshine on a cloudy day. Got the month of May. As he turns from the booth and re-enters the river of heaven, these dancers winding in brocades and silk sleeves, a faith-lit circle, briefly a swarm in the summer night. This next poem is, you know, I kind of, you know, what I'm known for is writing about Hawaii a lot, and it's odd because I think I write as much about LA and Europe as as Hawaii, but this is how, you know, you get typecast in this life. So here's my confirmation of being typecast. It's a poem about the first generation of Japanese in Hawaii. It's called Homage to a Picture Bride. When years were long with labor in the sugar fields, I sought a wife. Oh, by the way, it's a dramatic monologue. When years were long with labor in the sugar fields, I sought a wife at last, choosing her from a photograph. She was but 15, a shy child of a bride wrapped in faded kimono, as I likewise was wrapped in wind, a man of 30, weathered by work in the green seas of cane, my savings finally enough to take my wedding vows. Before then, it was to the coming world that I made vows, to wrest a new life from the earth, and leave the fields so I might cast my eyes without sorrow from mountains to the sea, never again to falsify who I was in a photograph, as though I were a clerk or saddler, sheltered from the constant winds, an image I'd sent, a deception to my young bride. She was young but daily growing, my new bride. We stood on the pier and took our vows, and I led her to the North Shore, its mountain torn by winds. Below them, the rippling green fields of cane stretching all the way to the sea, a landscape no one would care to photograph. Before we left, someone took a photograph, this laborer and downcast picture bride, half his age, at their dockside ceremony of vows, staged before a background of slate gray seas and the small curls of waves tossed by winds, impassive faces resigned to a hard life in the cane fields. So we were destined never to leave the fields. My wife gave birth to a son we did not photograph, as before he could cry, he was taken by the wind that came betrothed as his own promised bride, journeying from the afterworld over storm-tossed seas, our mortal dreams of a better life, all but disavowed. She herself died within a year of our vows, and so finally escaped the sugar fields, a ghost in flight, ha'alelehana, over the dread seas that never would be captured in a photograph, so that ever after only resolve would be my bride, and my mourning cloak a coat of harsh winds. Only the wind knows my sorrows now. Whatever vows my bride and I made are forever lost in the sugar fields. This photograph, the one moment we lived apart from life's cold seas. On that happy note, I was talking to two friends of mine at dinner tonight, the poets Tomas Morin and David, who's here from actually Brooklyn, but he grew up in San Diego. And we were talking about our early training in poetry. And I was lucky, gifted, to have been a student of some really terrific poets that Leo mentioned at the beginning. C.K. Williams, who was a tough hombre, and Howard Moss, a gentleman, and Charles Wright, a genius. And each of them taught me very many things about poetry and inside of my own poetry. They sort of reached down and, grabbed my spirit by the throat and pulled it out, where I'd sort of kept it hidden in a strange way. And one of the things that I sort of grew into as I kept writing poems through my career, such that is, was sort of slowly sliding into allowing myself to write formally, which I'd done as a graduate student, but I thought it was just exercises. And I hadn't really internalized the feeling of it. I remember the lessons Howard gave about rhyme schemes in a version of the Oresteia he worked on with Robert Lowell. And those lessons were so impressive and dazzling I couldn't do anything with them until I started hearing that music, partly through Howard's poems that I kept rereading, but also just living in poetry all this time. So I'm going to read a couple of poems in that mode. First one's called Litter for the Taking. Sort of an autobiography in poetry, I guess. My dream life started in LA's concrete world, a cityscape of cheap apartments and palm trees, crowned asphalt streets, blacktop playgrounds, a swirl with immigrant, black, and Asian kids, a wheeze of asthma in my chest, missing Hawaii and my playmate cousins, the sighing seashore that had, in foaming curls of white stories, given a pastoral and all its lore to paint my daydreams, vanish distress, and bring back the lost words of pitching waves, itinerant sellers of kulolo and fish, evenings of porch music and windward rains. I had these the way Muir had his sierras, a splendor alive in all my waking, a green mural of folded cliffs, plumeria blooms on patchy lawns, litter for the taking. Throughout childhood, I had my secret place, a splendor of mine amid urban squalor, palimpsests of imaginings to trace, while a car wreck screeched from the corner. I conjured yellow how flowers, tofu shops, fish hooks baited with pink shrimp in waters tumbled from mossy stones, slate bells of clouds, the rippled silk of trade winds in blue tatters woven across the lagoon's upturned face. A shut-in, latchkey kid after school, I made games of cardboard, string. A sheet of foil was a silver pond where white egrets raced. I've since taken survey of other lands, parades of volcanoes, museum halls. I lived for pleasures that came to hand the way sea-run fish school by a waterfall. I learned of purple wines and their terroir. I gathered postcards at a stop-and-go. I hiked along a narrow road one summer, chasing the ghosts of Sora and Basho. Another, my daughter ran on cobblestones down a winding, Kafkaesque street in Prague. Alarmed, just 5, she'd found herself alone while I strolled ahead, my mind in a fog. It moved back, at work on a fantasy, something to do with Florentine lunettes, or a late spring snow at Kinkakuji, a lace chain of smoke from a cigarette. Imitations are what I'd sought, innocence I had as though a child's, a saint's chorus, unaging wonders taken from guidebooks that might beguile and blaze to magnificence. A copse of oaks, a lawn of fallen umber leaves our refuge. My home is now my nation. Walls of Chinese art, rugs of Turkish weave. I'm content with quieter intimations. What do I do these days of idleness? Fugitive thoughts pitch up, the mind's coronas, an affair among redwoods in Inverness, a summer shower, phantoms and their auras. It's as though I took a road up mountain through fog for watercress near Waimea, Wham on the radio, then steady rain. Well, I dreamt an image, an idea that gave a moment's comfort when it came. I just came last night from a little village on the coast of southern France, on the Riviera, named Cassis, where I wrote a sequence of poems called The Surfaces of the Sea. And, it's an incredibly beguiling place. I could just stare at the water and not think about anything but water for hours and hours. And that's sort of what I did when I wrote this sequence. I call it The Surfaces of the Sea because the way that the wind moves changes the mobile presentation of its image in a way that is just beguiling. But, it's also a little in-joke about sea surface full of clouds, about Wallace Stevens. But this is the end poem of that sequence. It's called On Emptiness, and the emptiness I speak of is a Buddhist emptiness. Samadhi, maybe, The Tang Chinese did it best. A poet's solo and progressions gathered from wilderness, while he stood beside the long vertical scroll of a cataract hung by a natural god, its script the Heraclitean flow of the way. Or sitting on mats at tea with a friend and fellow bureaucrat, posted on borderlands far from the capital of their educations, the two of them engaged in brisk repartee, citing amiably from the Book of Songs, their light banter of fellowship of otium, the lyric axis of contemplation, while the world persists a whirl in famine, regional war, or harvests of plenty. What they took from one another, gazing at the festival moon as it rose over crags of mountains, the slithers and fountains of rivers surrounding their hut, 10-foot square, was a joyous loyalty to reflection, a stilling of the mind that invites the soft thoughts of an unknotted wind, caravels of contentment with the grand whatever. Let it be was not to them a credo, but daily practice, a hermeneutics of calm retreat, like those aquamarine waters below my window today, only ripples and whirls like sapphire fingerprints, the ephemeral wings of bleu de France upon the sea. In MASH, the colonel in command fly-fished a trickle of stream, the middle of the Korean War, checked out and privileged to pull a wine glass and bottle of Chardonnay from his creel. Did he have it right? A firecrest chitters, cicadas klaxon in waves, clicking the thoracic chambers of amplification, and an excursion boat's engine drones on through the harbor, trailing a long wake of immaculate lace over the channel's Persian blue table. The slate sea fills my window, and I can see the horizon from here, the white palette knife of a sail just below it, and I wonder if the pale flamingos of Camargue might present themselves to me someday. Why has this lesson been so hard to relearn all these years? Why have I allowed the settled law of my soul to be disrupted by the tyrannous magistrates of the everyday, a groundswell of incessant woe flushing a salty tincture of gentian through my mouth? My head constantly hung like a seabird hunched before its dive, instead of lifted to meet the new day's yellow light. I've strong espresso in the morning, and some kind of warbler makes its melodic cry outside my window. I can't see Africa from here, but I can feel its continental drift, a steady tumulus of soul-making, arising from perigee and about to cross the expansive idols of ocean. If only I could stand the infinite measures, wait long enough, and not waste their buoyant resolve. If only I might dwell in emptiness the rest of my days. So this last poem is kind of like the title poem of the book. I had the, well, you know, I'll tell you a secret behind it. It's about Hawaii, but I wrote it in Paris. It's the best of both worlds. Yeah. So it's true, you know, that I sold my soul, my Hawaiian soul, my barefoot Hawaiian soul, for Vichy Soise, you know. I want to thank Deborah Garrison for her faith in me through the years, and for getting here on a broken foot, which I thought the perfect excuse not to come. You know, it was New York excuse all over it, but here she is, proving that, what do I know, right? So this is called An Ocean of Clouds. I sing for clouds, constant rains, a fern chorus of things forgotten, ginger flowers of sadness my mother bore, enormous hollows of the family's past. My father, the dutiful son, come to run the store by the volcano, called by his father, promising a new life, its open door that swung shut after barely a year. They left, me still a newborn in their arms, wailing in complaint for the swift travel, headed to Kahuku, the new truck farms, old plantation, and its steel sugar castle. I grew to 6 there, a boy barefoot on dirt and gravel roads, green temple moss by the graveyard. There were shorebirds in suits of slanting rain, a gray-brown surf, pebble-tossed, not fit for swimming, a tired sandspit's drift that marked the margin of all our dreaming. And what was that? The green folds of cliffs chanted our imagined names, caught winds heaving an ocean of clouds that piled like sea wrack, muffling the mill's whistle. Windrows of rain gathered upon the mountain's emerald stacks, the black crown of the day's celebration. Hidden within the sighing sugar cane, here I first raised my voice in harmless praise. I lifted my eyes to the moon's white sphere and sang a song I hoped would bless all my days. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Garrett. It's my pleasure to introduce next up to read Edward Hirsch. His My Childhood in Pieces, if you haven't opened it up yet, begins with the prologue. My grandparents taught me to write my sins on paper and cast them into water on the first day of the new year. They didn't expect an entire book. Hirsch balances the brevity of each piece of prose with the depth of heart of an entire childhood and family. He's a Chicago native and MacArthur Fellow, a celebrated poet, and a tireless advocate for poetry. He has published 10 books of poetry, including The Living Fire, New and Selected Poems, Gabriel, a poem, a book-length elegy for his son, and Stranger by Night. He has also published 8 books of prose, among them How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry, a national bestseller, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, and The Heart of American Poetry. He has received numerous prizes, including the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Pablo Neruda Presidential Medal of Honor, and the National Jewish Book Award. He has taught at Wayne State University and the University of Houston. Since 2003, he has been president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and he lives in Brooklyn. Please give a warm welcome to Edward Hirsch.
So glad to be with you. Garrett's written a wonderful book of soul making. It's just great to hear these poems. Thanks to Leo and to Rob and to Jane and to the Poets House and to PSA for backing us up. I have the wittiest looking book ever from Knopf. You just want to drive in and see what's playing. Thank you to our Knopf team, Deborah Garrison and Zulema Zugalde and Noah Hoff, and thank you all for coming. When I was 69, my mother died, and she had a very bad, long old age, and she died of dementia. And I mourned for a year, and the next year I turned 70, and the pandemic hit, and 70 is a time when you look back on your life, and I began to look back on mine. And during that year, I was writing a book on American poetry called The Heart of American Poetry, and Garrett was writing The Perfect Sound, his book on music, and it was just a tremendous experience. We were trading our manuscripts back and forth. And during that year, we each wrote about how we met each other. If you want to read fiction, I recommend his version. And if you want to hear what happened when we met in 1982, you could read my version. And at the end of the year, I began to write down things my mother said. And they began to bring back the world that she had. The first thing I wrote was I was 8 years old. My mother was stirring a can of soup on the stove. And I said, you really shouldn't make fun of me. You're my mother. And she said, don't be so sure, kid. And then I remembered when I was in high school, I was reading about the Enlightenment. And I said, hey, Mom, I'm reading about the Enlightenment. Did you ever hear about it? It's the study of universal truths. And she said, you want a universal truth? Women like shoes. And I was also, my second father was around. And I said, hey, Dad, do you ever Do you think there's such a thing as common sense reasoning? He said, yes, you don't have it. And then my first father, his name was Harold Rubenstein. Everyone called him Ruby. I started writing down things he said. He had a lot of sayings. Um, he had a sign on his desk that said, all I want is an honest advantage. He was in scrap metal, and he had a lot of sayings about food. Like he said, a bagel is a delivery system for cream cheese. And if you want a vegetable, eat a tomato with pickles. And if someone orders white bread on a sandwich, you know their family came over on the Mayflower. Um, and the greatest steak in the world cannot compare to a kosher hot dog. And then he had a lot of sayings about business, like anyone who says that they're not the sort of person who cheats you in business is exactly the sort of person who tries to cheat you in business. Or what's a cosigner? A schmuck with a pen. And I started writing these down, and they just brought back the people to me, and it started to bring back the world. And then I started telling well, they're just memories, but anecdotes like this. So I remember, so the first anecdote was I was 7, I think, and a girl was going to hit my sister Leanie. A girl named Roberta was going to hit my sister Leanie with a broom handle. So I stepped forward to stop this from happening, and she just brought the handle down on my head, and there was just blood everywhere. So I ran home screaming, my brains are falling out, my brains are falling out. And my parents were divorced. My grandmother was taking care of us. So my grandmother was very calm. She grabbed my sister and me by the hand. She took her purse. She took us out, got a cab. Cab pulled over. We got in the cab. My grandmother said, you don't have the brains you're born with, so I don't see how anything can start falling out now. Um, and then I gave a title to something she said, which is called Brain Sale. Uh, she said, if we had a brain sale, I'd charge the most for yours. And I said, why? Because I'm the smartest one in the family? She said, no, because yours have never been used. So I moved to my grandfather. He had a lot of parables. The first piece in the book, I gave it the title, All Sales Are Final, is my grandfather's parable. God is like my old boss on Maxwell Street. He said, you may get home and discover that your new shirt doesn't have a back, but you're still not going to get a refund. And once we're in a market and he holds up a can of tomatoes and he says, how is God different than this can of tomatoes? So I said, well, God is fresh and not canned. And he said, no, God does not have an expiration date. And suddenly my world just came flooding back to me. And I realized I could write my story and my parents' story, just capturing with each piece. They're structured like jokes. Each piece has a title and then a location or a locale or a story, and then a coil or cut. They're not all meant to be funny, but they're all structured like that. And somehow it's sort of a kind of Jewish Proustian style of throwing you back all the way into the past. And so you're just inside it. And it just captured the people for me. So I just kept going. And so my parents started going together when they were in 7th grade. They went together all through high school. And then they got married when my mom was 21. My dad was about to turn 20, 21. And then they had me. Uh, I was born on January 20th. Uh, my mom rushed to the hospital. I was born at 2 a.m. She said she was having a nightmare. And my mom's younger sister was 20. My Auntie B said, this is just literally what she said. I just wrote it down. It was called In the Nursery. I started to sob when I saw you in the nursery. Auntie B said, I'd never seen such a strange looking infant. You were all eyes and nose, and your face trailed behind. Your hair was spiky. You looked emaciated. You looked like you were born in an alley. And then, but then I added the next thing, family resemblance. All my life, people have said that I look like B. So I was very pleased with myself for the truth of that. Um, and then I once met a man who made me scream. He carried a little black box of instruments and mumbled mumbo jumbo over my body. It was the mohel who circumcised me. So my sister was born a year later, and all hell started to break loose with my parents. My father was a gambler. He would disappear for a week at a time, and my mom just guessed that he was playing cards somewhere or other. And he would come back, and if he had won, he'd bring a frilly pink dress for my sister, leaving the price on. That was his idea of an apology. And I heard about this all my life. He'd leave huge wad of cash on the dresser. And my mom had a tremendous regret about it. She talked about it the rest of her life. She never stole any of the money. This was her regret. My father inherited his father's white metal smelting business and got rich quick. It was the Korean War. Aluminum was a new metal. He knew how to get material, and he could make a penny a pound on a deal. And he was off. And he started running with a new crowd. My mom didn't like them. She thought they were nouveau riche narcissists and status seekers. He completely agreed. He just didn't see the problem. And one day he won $6,000 in a card game. And he was with his friend Maury. They were partners, and Maury was older and wiser and didn't want him to just blow it. So they went right to a Cadillac dealer, and he bought a red Cadillac. And he drove the Cadillac straight to Los Angeles, where he had a girlfriend who was a gangster's mole named Ann. And they hung out at the Formosa Cafe, which my father loved because Bugsy Siegel used to have a booth there with a safe embedded in the floor where he could give a kickback from the place. And my father loved it because you could still feel the mobster vibe. But then Ann dumped him, and he came back, and he started dating my mom again. But when he left us, I was 2, and I don't remember ever living with him. And he never moved in again. My mom told me that I had a rash all over my body that lasted for weeks, and he didn't come home, and I didn't get over my allergies. And after he was dating my mom, when you're writing a memoir, you sometimes find I kept running into the same thing where different people are telling me different stories. So I decided to handle this by just reporting 2 different versions of the same thing. So this was my father's second wife was named Beverly Rubenstein, and this is testimony according to Beverly Rubenstein. Ruby had gone to New York to cut a side deal on scrap aluminum, and he had a diaphragmatic hernia, and he went to Mount Sinai Hospital. My mother heard about it. She flew to New York. She walked into his hospital room. She saw his girlfriend Ann lying on the bed. She walked out. That was the end of it. Then my sister Arlene, version recorded by Arlene Hirsch, airline called to confirm a reservation for Mr. and Mrs. Rubenstein. My mother knew something suspicious was going on. She flew to New York. She knew my father always stayed at the Waldorf Astoria. She went there. She knocked on the door. He opened. She walked in. She saw his girlfriend Pat lying on the bed. She turned around and walked out. That was the end of it. So the next thing I wrote was unreliable narrators. Everyone in this story is an unreliable narrator. Leni and I were too young to know what was going on. The adults were crazed. They weren't even adults. And then finally, all parties can agree that Harold Rubenstein cheated on Irma Ginsburg Rubenstein, and that was the end of it. So that's how I handled it whenever I had diverting stories of what's going on. So I want to read you a little bit about my grandfather, because he's the one that first introduced me to the idea of intellectual life. My first bookstore. My grandfather took me to Moshe Shashinsky's bookstore. There were a lot of dusty books in languages I couldn't understand. I asked him, "Why do you like it here so much?" He gestured toward the shelves. This is my other family. My grandfather thought that we were people of the book. His friend Meyer believed in the book of the people. Meyer was a mensch who was trying to improve the world, my grandfather said, but he was going about it all wrong because he was still a communist. He had missed the news bulletin about Stalin. Meyer said, "The masses are no asses." My grandfather shook his head. "Are you certain about that?" Ashkenazim. The old men spoke with accents. They had fled pogroms or 10 years of military service or bad marriages. They checked other on governmental forms because they did not consider themselves white. That was for Gentiles. "Use your kepi," my grandfather said, which meant my noggin. "We're not white. We're Jewish." Oi. My grandfather resorted to Yiddish when he was frustrated. He said, "Oi gut, oh my God," or "Oi gewalt, good grief." But I got confused and mixed up God and grief. My grandfather, there's a line by Wallace Stevens where he says, "We were as Danes in Denmark all day long." My mother said about my grandfather, he never knew how to be an American in America, and none of his friends did. They just couldn't adapt. They just couldn't figure out how to make a living. They couldn't understand capitalism. So he was a Latvian in America. But my parents, they were on the hustle. And they were the next generation. And they didn't see themselves as separate. They just wanted to fit in. So on the census, the Eastern European friends of my grandfather, they checked other. My parents, they checked white. And when we moved to Skokie, which is a suburb of Chicago, there were like 58% of the people were Jewish there. And there were about 7,500 Holocaust survivors. You can still see people walking down the streets, like carrying you see someone carrying a bag of Bialys and he'd have numbers on his arm. And so European history is far away, but you saw that. You knew that there were people who considered themselves separate, and then there were your parents who were on the hustle and adapting. And I think both of those worlds, that stuck in me. That registered as in my identity, these two generations clashing. And while I was writing this story, I began to realize that my stand-up comedy was an elegy, because the world I was writing about is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. I mean, Skokie is still there, but the world and the people that I were trying to capture and bring back, they're not there anymore. So I just want to read you a little bit now about starting to write poetry. First of all, I thought this was good. Fortune cookie. My fortune was preposterous. Someday you will look back fondly on the past. Dark Night of the Soul, high school edition. I started crying at unexpected times. I burst into tears on the way to school. I started to write things down to see if I felt better. What I wrote came out in lines. I called it poetry. Eyewash. My eyes were red from crying. We had a little blue eyewash cup shaped like an eye. It was vintage. I tilted it back and soothed my sadness with saline. My feelings were so strong I couldn't control them. They did what they wanted. Sometimes we traveled in different directions. Whenever they got too far away from me, I ran after them. Boyhood neighborhood. Abraham Lincoln said his boyhood neighborhood in Indiana was as unpoetical as any spot on the earth. He'd never been to Skokie. In honor of Lincoln, it's best to be honest. My suburb is one place I never planned to write about. My new vocation. Reading poetry, I felt poetry reading me. I knew what Wordsworth was talking about when he crossed the Alps. That's because Leanie and I used to race up and down an enormous hill in Montrose Park. It was as steep as the Alps. Wordsworth wandered lonely as a cloud. But did he go sledding like us? You skidded fast. You didn't have time to reflect on it. I didn't like Carl Sandburg because everyone else in Chicago did. His town was long gone. Hog butcher for the world, I don't eat pork. City of the big shoulders, I'd rather slouch. The fog comes in on little cat feet. I'm allergic to cats. When I was lonely late at night, I climbed out the basement window and circled Laramie Park. I walked past the farthest city light. I recited poems I was trying to memorize. That's how I became acquainted with the night. I'd never looked at the sky, really looked, until I walked around the park at night. No wonder Gerard Manley Hopkins' sonnet, The Starlight Night, has 14 exclamation points. Look at the stars. Look up at the skies. I found my grandfather's leather-bound copy of Longfellow's collected poems on a bookshelf in the basement. The upper right-hand corner of a page was turned down at the Jewish cemetery at Newport. He was sending me a message. Still here. Proverbial poetry. 1. I asked my grandmother if the street where I was born was named after Lord Byron. She said, I doubt it. I never saw any lords or ladies in that neighborhood. 2. I left the Coney Island of the mine on the kitchen table. I took the girls to Coney Island, Grandma said. They drove me crazy. 3. My grandmother worried that I was becoming like my grandfather. You have the same tendencies. You think every lens grinder is Spinoza. She was afraid that I would never earn a living. You're a dreamer, she said. Just remember that dumplings in a dream are not dumplings, but a dream. Hobby horse. Stop horsing around, my mom said. Poetry's fine so long as it sells products. Otherwise, it's just a hobby. No one gets paid for a hobby. Shine on. I wrote a poem called Turtle Wax. It had shiny things in it. I had no idea what they meant. I got mad at Leanie because she couldn't figure it out either. Leanie said, why aren't you talking to me? You should have stopped talking to yourself instead. I punished Leanie by not reading her my poetry anymore. What a masochist. She liked the punishment. A townie's philosophy. When you drove east and crossed McCormick Boulevard into Evanston, you became instantly more sophisticated. Around Northwestern, I pretended to be a student and hung out at the student center where you could see the lake through the picture window. You never blew your cover if you never talked to anyone. I snuck into the library. I spent so much time at the card catalog, you'd think I was dating it. I scoured the open stacks and camped out on the floor. No one stepped over me because the section was deserted. Propositions. Aristotle called God the unmoved mover. It made God sound like the owner of a trucking company. The boss sits upstairs and pulls strings while employees pack boxes down below. Workers need a union. It wasn't Plato's fault. Some Florentine dude in the 15th century came up with the idea of amor platonicus, the scourge of high school boys. Know thyself. I think, therefore I am. But I wasn't thinking when I made that wisecrack. Does that mean I'm not? What a mess. I had trouble proving I exist, but I couldn't disprove it either. Ditto for God. Where can I find a monad? I may have slipped a biography of Nietzsche into my backpack. I was reading about the theory of eternal return when my parents burst into the room. I returned the book. I just want to say one final thing about why I hate the song Little Boxes. And this was a song that was extremely popular, first from Pete Seeger. And then when I was a senior in high school, there was a singer named Melvina Reynolds. And there was an album called Melvina Reynolds Sings the Truth. And she's the one who wrote the song Little Boxes. She was driving through Daly, California, and she saw hundreds of tract houses, and she decided that everyone was living in little ticky-tack boxes, living ticky-tack lives, all the same. I'm sure you know the song. It's very catchy. I liked it too, until I thought about it. And what I thought about was that driving through a neighborhood is not the same thing as living in it. And I grew up in one of those tract houses. And so I knew that all the people living in those houses were actually weirdos trying to fit in, that they weren't living cookie cutter lives at all. Their lives were much stranger and more interesting and complicated than anyone would have known. And I knew this because I had learned it in my own family. Thank you, everybody. Can I start by saying that my parents loved Garrett? They were completely crazy about him. And Garrett once stayed with my parents when I wasn't there. And my parents had a little stand where my book was there. But when I came home, my book was gone and his book, The River of Heaven. Garrett had replaced me as the favorite son with my parents. My parents loved Garrett.
Yeah, they like me because I ate a lot.
Yeah, true.
Well, what shall we do? Sing songs or what?
No, I think we should say that it's an incredible thing to be friends for 45 years and to publish books at the same time. I mean, that's never happened. And it's just a miracle of friendship to me, and just incredible that we were able to do this just at the same time, and that we're still here and we're still in the fight, and we've been at it a long time, and our friendship has been tremendously sustaining to me. And so just want to celebrate it for a moment.
Yeah, I feel like saying something really cynical. But you can't top Eddie's sincerity. It just sort of bleeds out of him like maple syrup.
Garrett was there when I was giving a reading in the 80s in Chicago. My parents were there, and I read a poem about a seventh grade science project. And my mom was in the back, and she shouted, "That's not how I remember it." And I go, "How do you remember it, Mom?" She goes, "Your father made that science project for you." I was like, oh God, it was.
Eddie's not saying what really happened, though. What really happened was he was reading with an illustrious formal poet who was as boring as fuck. And in those days, Eddie was climbing. He wasn't such a, star. And he was basically kissing ass the whole time. So we're riding in a cab away from the reading. It was at MLA, as I recall. And and Irma, Eddie's mom, said, I can't make sense at all of what so-and-so was saying. I mean, why does he just say it outright? Why does he have to do all that rhyming and stuff? It just doesn't make any sense at all. And I said, I agree with you 100%, Mrs. Hirsch. And she loved me ever since.
Yeah, he said, I agree with your aesthetic. I agree with your aesthetic. But you're reminding me now that when I was, I was at a bookstore in Chicago, and it was How to Read a Poem, and my parents were there, and my dad was in a wheelchair then. But when I started talking, my mom started going like this. It's very distracting. It was like a group like this, and my mom was just the whole time she's going like this. So finally I go, "Mom, it's really distracting to do that. What's going on?" She goes, "Oh, honey, you're giving too much away. No one will ever buy your book." So you want to talk about each other's books? You want to open it up to the audience?
No, I want to tell a story about reading together in Honolulu.
Okay.
So we're reading together in Honolulu at a place called K Pasta, believe it or not. It was really a shitty Italian restaurant in Honolulu in the tourist side of town, which they booked us to for some reason. I don't know why. We got a review that night, and they said that, I don't know if these guys are any good as poets, but they sure are funny. Which we took as the best review we've ever got.
Super.
But just before then, we were meeting the great biographer of Henry James, Leon Adele. We had been staying at W.S. Merwin's house in Maui. And we flew over to Honolulu to do this reading. And Eddie was staying at the East and West Center at the University of Hawaii. And I don't know where I was staying, probably with relatives. Who knows? I was probably sleeping on the beach. And I get to meet Leon and his wife, Marjorie Sinclair, who was the widow of the first president of the University of Hawaii and later married Leon after her first husband died. Well, we're waiting in the little VW bug, and Leon's not interested in me at all. He goes, "Tell me what this guy Edward Hirsch is like." I thought, here's my opening. You know, he stayed up all night last night reading the condensed version of the biography of Henry James. That's how studious and assiduous he is. So Eddie shows up and he sits down, and Leon says, "Hello, I hear you've been boning up, my boy." And then Eddie gives me his scowl from the front seat. I think I got him good. You know, and the thing about it is, it's sort of like rubber bullets that we shoot at each other all our lives. We're just trying to see how much pain we can inflict without killing each other. You know,
Really, Del, while Garrett and I were reading, he was going to give us copies of books that he had written introductions to. And you could see that he was reading his own introduction while we were reading. He goes, "This is good." He goes, "This is really good." Not our reading, his own thing. And when I got done, he said, "That was a very good reading, young man. You could almost be a novelist." Okay, yeah, take it.
he didn't say anything about my work.
Yeah.
Well, how about questions or comments? I mean,
Yeah, should we open it up to the
Yeah, let's do
audience?
it.
Does anyone have questions?
I'll tell you something that you wouldn't expect, that Garrett is an expert in Yiddishkeit. And that when I was writing my book, I would often call him and say, "What do you think of this, Garrett?" And he'd go, "Nah, tighten it, focus. It was funnier the first time." So they say, "Funny the first time I heard it. Keep it closer." It was better when I heard it in the writer's room in Los Angeles. It was like really tough on Yiddishkeit, but he really helped me focus and get the cut. And then every once in a while he'd laugh, and that was victory. I get victory.
Eddie had a tendency, like all literary critics, to over-explain, explaining the joke. And of course, that always kills the funny.
Yeah.
Y'all don't probably know this, but I studied how to write comedy under the great Jewish comedian Pat Morita. This is true. I wrote for him when he had a TV show for ABC called Mr. T and Tina. It wasn't funny. You know, I tried to make it funny, but they killed me because I was 23 years old. Everybody else in the room was 60, and they're all comics from the Catskills. They resented this. What do they call me? I won't say it. This kid coming in trying to hoard in on our shtick. Yeah. So I finally got even with them by criticizing Eddie. Okay, come on, give us a question. You know, otherwise it's going to be a total failure here.
Well, I can clearly see both of you have very distinct poetry styles, but also very different personalities. So I was wondering what the process of giving each other feedback on your work looks like, and what that collaboration feels like.
Um, we've been trading manuscripts a very long time. Our friendship began in sympathy for each other's work. And we've always loved each other's work, and we're also honest with each other. So I think that we know the whole body of the other person's work we met right after our first books came out. And so we could see the growth, we see what's repetitive, we see what's moving newly, and we trust each other. And I think that when you trust each other, you can then say, "This isn't working, and you need to go back, and you need to make it better, you need to refine it, or this is really working, or this part is working, or this is what it wants to be." And so the last two books, more than ever, we've been like trading stuff back and forth as the books have come. And when I was writing Heart of American Poetry, Garrett is just so learned. He was just helping me all the way on thinking through the poets. And what Garrett was really encouraging me to do was think for myself, like not to turn to the archive and see what all the critics said about American poets. Just like, what do you actually think about Sunday Morning? What do you actually think about Proofrock? And Garrett really encouraged me to just go out hard on my own stories about what I thought about each line, each stanza, each poem, each body of work, each poet. There are 40 poets in that book. And Garrett really helped me think through what each one is.
You know, the baseline was from when we. Is this on?
Yeah.
The baseline was from when we first met. I think we could recognize the sort of working class roots and communities we came from, whether they be Jewish in Skokie or Japanese in Gardena, that we saw that there was an aspiration towards a voice that we learned from the great voice of American poetry in general, and the inspiration we took from, as Eddie might have said, the archive. And they weren't dead to us. The great poetry was not dead. I mean, you know, it lived in our hearts, it lived in our souls, it lived in the way we tried to sing and teach ourselves to sing. And I remember when we first met, we talked straight from the heart about what we thought about each of these different poets. And that's how we sort of became friends, because we read everything the other guy had read, and we hadn't met anyone else that had done that. The other thing was we loved the great American critics of the early 20th century or the mid 20th century, like Alfred Kazin, who wrote on Native Ground, you know, this Jewish American intellectual who wrote about 19th century American literature and the early 20th century American novel. F.O. Matheson, gay critic at Harvard, who was hounded and outed for being gay, who wrote the greatest book on American literature called The American Renaissance, on Melville, Hawthorne, and Poe, and who sort of enlarged our own hearts as young aspiring poets. And that was sort of like the baseline of our ambitions. It wasn't about career or prizes or commitment, but it was about reaching that heart, but not disavowing what we came from, you know. And I think we trusted that and saw that in each other, so we could always come from that and comment. So even as, you know, we moved along, I mean, we'd still return to that first conversation we had, you know, in the stupid book fair at MLA when we first met. Oh yeah, people always say, how did you guys meet? They expected we grew up together in high school. And we actually met at MLA, you know, one of the few times I've ever gone. Yeah. Does that help?
Different. Yeah. What if you had a different list in Heart of American Poetry?
Say it into the mic. I could.
List in Heart of American Poetry than Ed picked.
He's saying, would you have a different list of poets? He's trying to cause trouble. Trying to cause trouble is saying, what did he do that you didn't like, and what's your list? How would it be different? He probably resent that I put you in it.
I'm thinking about this. No, I didn't think about it that way. I thought about the heart that Eddie put into it himself, you know, how he responded to each of the poets. I didn't think of the list, the hit list, as it were. You know, I don't really think like, I mean, that's what things about, that's how we are, you know. We don't do this top 10 shit, you know, or top 40s or whatever, you know. It's just not like that. We just think of what has heart, what inspires, how do they sustain us. And that's how I came in criticism of Eddie's work, because I said, tell us about what, you know, going to fucking Theodore Gretti's grave. I mean, you drove all the way from Detroit to Ypsilanti just to be at his grave. I mean, you got to put that story in the essay. You can't just write about how you read the fucking shit in books, man. You got to talk about how you felt to just pay homage. You know, you had to stand on the grass that grew around his gravestone. You got to put that in the essay, because that shows the heart of a younger man paying homage to again, that great voice that inspired us when we were young, you know? And it was never about, yeah, so I didn't even think that way. I only talked about getting more heart into it, soul and all that, I don't think I ever thought about that. I never.
I mean, it was the anniversary of the Library of America, so their 40th year anniversary. So they're
I think
40.
I did say you shouldn't put. No, I shouldn't say.
Garrett would definitely not have chosen all the poets, and they're not even all my favorite poets by any means. One of the things is one, it had to be representative of a sort of evolving new canon, but also I had to have something to say personally about it. That was part of the poems I chose, so that I didn't want to just repeat what other people had said. So I only looked for poems where I really had an entry, and where I had a story to tell.
No, that's not true. I remember the essay on Hart Crane in Brooklyn Bridge. And you didn't tell the story you'd always told me about walking to the Brooklyn Bridge and seeing it for the first time. Wasn't in the essay. It was all this lit crit shit. I said, dude, you gotta walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. You gotta tell that story. You gotta put your feet on the bridge, man. And he goes, okay. It was
Okay, didn't do it.
right.
Yeah,
That's not true. See, it wasn't like that.
Yeah.
He kept excising his spirit. He was trying to check the box that said white.
That's cold. 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 Yeah.
We look to you, both of you. You are such powerful presences in our poetry pantheon for many of us in this room and outside of this room. And I just want to ask you to reflect on, especially given what we're all facing now. You guys have, now you're enjoying this stage where you've written a lot of books. Your words are on the page. You can enjoy continuing that into, we hope, more decades. But you already came up through a lot of stuff together. Do you have hope for the younger generations who are coming up in poetry? I mean, what is your feeling about what the young ones are facing?
Well, Eddie's made a great statement on the 100th anniversary of the Guggenheim, and I think he just ought to quote it.
I just have a hopeful idea. I run the Guggenheim Foundation. It's the 100th anniversary. I gave a speech that Garrett's talking about what is hopeful in the American spirit and what it is and what I believe in. And I'll get to your point, but what I believe is there's something deeply American in the idea of the individual and the community. And I got this idea from Walt Whitman. Oneself I sing, a single separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. As soon as Whitman sings himself, which he always does, as soon as he celebrates himself, he immediately pivots and turns to the democracy, the larger whole, the mass. And again in the great American work, you see a kind of dialogue between the individual and the commons, the celebration of the unique self and the larger common good. And in Emerson, for example, who's always speaking of self-reliance, and in his first book, Nature, he says, why should not we also have a religion of ourselves and not of theirs? Why should not we think for ourselves? But he doesn't say, why should not I? And so this kind of dialogue about what is good for the collective as well as what's good by celebrating the individual is what I think will also live on in American poetry, in the spirit of American poetry. When Wallace Stevens wrote these lines, he said, the voice that is great within us rises up. He doesn't say the voice that is great within me. And I guess the thing I'm most hopeful about in younger poets is when they see the larger whole and when they think not just of their own identities, but how their identities participate in a larger American project. And Garrett and I still believe in this project, and we still believe in a whole that includes marginalized communities. And we remember a time when American poetry was not so inclusive, when American poetry didn't include a lot of people. And now it does. American poetry now brings a lot of people into the room. But they don't always see how they are singing part of a larger whole. And from my point of view, the thing that I like most is when American poets, from wherever they come from, also see themselves as participating in something that we think of as poetry. Because Garrett and I have always loved the great eloquence of the tradition. And we don't think that excludes people, we think it includes them. And so there's a way to kind of reach forward from wherever you come from into the larger democratic whole. And that's what I find most hopeful in young poets and in trying to bring young poets into the world of poetry that we love.
Yeah, I think that there's been a swing towards isolationist identity, not just nationalistic isolation, as we have recently experienced in the governance of our own country, but in terms of the culture wars, people see themselves only in terms of these separatist identities and not in the collective. And it's a way also to recognize the diversity of our culture. But what I've seen is that people tend to get siloed. I mean, we go to I was talking to Tomas and David today. I said, the last time I read this abomination called the AWP, there were all these Chicano poets that came up to me and said they wanted to come to my reading, but they had their own event to go to. And so sorry, but I really won't like your work. And this kind of balkanization, according to perceived ethnic sexuality restrictions, has sort of created a kind of separatism and isolation and siloing within the way people sort of identify themselves. And they're not reaching, as they say, reach across the aisle. They're not reaching towards a collective. And I think that's always a problem. I grew up in Hawaii as a kid, and I saw the material example of this kind of thing. There was a plantation in Kahuku, owned by Castle and Cook, C&H Sugar, right? There was a Filipino camp, a Chinese camp, a Japanese camp, and a Portuguese camp. You know what the revolutionary idea was in 1924? For everybody to strike together against C&H. Across the Filipino, they were known as Catholics, the Portuguese and the Filipino, across the Buddhists and the Confucianists, were all band together and all go on strike together. What a fucking revolutionary idea. You know what I mean? So now this has come to me to be perpetuated within ideas of cultural, ethnic, and sexual identities that separate us and in some ways, dividing our attention to only the sort of socially trademarked identities. I think that's a problematic. Now, I have insisted from the beginning of my writing that I'm an Asian American poet, but that's not a limited identity. It's a diverse identity within. Like I said, I wrote about Hawaii and Paris. I don't feel that's a problem. But I know a lot of people in Hawaii do. And one reason I still think they're on the plantation. You know what I'm saying? That's a problem. I think there are more sophisticated ways of perpetuating that, and people practice it, but they have not self-critiqued. It's an old phrase and cliche now. They have not deconstructed their own isolationism. Yeah.
Thank you so much. What beautiful thoughts for us to close on, and thank